Vincent van Gogh never set foot in Japan. He never saw Mount Fuji, never walked the streets of Tokyo, never met a single Japanese artist. And yet, the man who painted sunflowers and the starry night spent the final years of his life chasing one idea: that France could somehow become his Japan. He copied Hiroshige's woodblock prints, brushstroke by brushstroke. He hung Japanese prints across his walls. He even painted himself as a Japanese monk. So how did a Dutch painter who never left Europe become more obsessed with Japan than almost anyone in the history of art? To understand that, we have to go back to a world where most people in Europe had never seen a single piece of Japanese art. For more than 200 years, Japan had kept its doors shut to the outside world. Foreign trade was banned, foreigners were turned away, and to most Europeans the country was little more than a rumor. That changed in 1854, when American Commodore Matthew Perry sailed his warships into a Japanese harbor and forced the country to sign a trade agreement called the Convention of Kanagawa. Almost overnight, Japan reopened to the West. What followed was a flood. Japanese fans, silk kimonos, painted folding screens, porcelain, and most of all, woodblock prints began pouring into the ports of Paris and Amsterdam. These prints, known as Ukiyo-E, were cheap to make and cheap to buy. In Japan, they were the popular art of ordinary people, pictures of kabuki actors, courtesans, landscapes, and everyday city life. In Europe, they looked like nothing anyone had ever seen. By the time the great world fairs in London and Paris put Japanese art on display, the city of Paris was gripped by a full-blown craze. The French even gave it a name: Japanisme. The most ambitious painters in the city were buying these prints by the stack. Claude Monet covered the walls of his home with them. Edgar Degas and Henri de Toulouse-Lautrec studied them closely. Japanese art was quietly rewiring the way Europe's artists thought about color and space. And in the middle of all of this, in the spring of 1886, a struggling Dutch painter arrived in Paris. At first, he barely noticed. His name was Vincent van Gogh, and he had come to live with his younger brother Theo, who managed an art gallery in the Montmartre district. Vincent had already stumbled onto a few Japanese woodcuts a year earlier, down in the docklands of Antwerp, where ships from the east unloaded their cargo. He had bought a small handful and pinned them to the walls of his room, but it was Paris that turned a passing interest into something much deeper. Just around the corner from the brothers' apartment sat the shop of an art dealer named Siegfried Bing. Inside were thousands of Japanese prints, stacked in drawers and portfolios. Van Gogh started spending hours there, pulling out print after print, studying the colors and the strange, daring compositions. He befriended a kindly old paint seller named Pri Tanguy, another fixture of the Paris art world, who traded in these images. And then Vincent did something that tells you everything about him. He didn't just admire the prints, he started buying them in bulk. Together with Theo, he built up a collection of around 660 Japanese woodblock prints. He wasn't chasing the rarest or the finest examples. He went for quantity, grabbing cheap, brightly colored sheets by the bundle. Part of the plan was even to sell them off and make a little money. In 1887, he organized an exhibition of his prints at the Café du Tambourin, a Montmartre hangout for artists run by a woman named Agostina Segatori. He hung the walls with Japanese woodcuts and hoped collectors would buy. Almost nobody did. The show was a commercial flop, and the brothers were left with stacks of unsold prints, but that failure was secretly the best thing that could have happened to him. Because now, Vincent had hundreds of Japanese prints sitting in his apartment and nothing to do but study them. So he did what every serious student of art has always done. He copied them. In 1887, Van Gogh sat down with a print by the Japanese master Utagawa Hiroshige, a rainy street scene called Sudden Shower at Atake, where tiny figures hurry across a wooden bridge under a sudden downpour. Vincent traced the outlines, scaled them up, and rebuilt the whole image in oil paint. He called it Bridge in the Rain. He even painted a decorative border around it, covered in Japanese characters he copied from other prints and could not actually read. He did it again with another Hiroshige design, a flowering plum tree, turning it into a glowing canvas of fiery sky and dark-reaching branches. And he did it a third time with a Japanese courtesan, an image he had found on the cover of a French magazine called Paris Illustre in a special issue titled simply Le Japon. The original had been designed by an artist named Keisai Eisen. Van Gogh traced the figure, enlarged her, and wrapped her in a lush border of bamboo, water plants, and frogs borrowed from other Japanese prints. These weren't lazy knockoffs. This is how a painter teaches his own hands a brand new language. And the careful tracings Vincent made for these copies still survive today, quiet little proof of just how seriously he studied every single line. Once you know what Van Gogh was studying, you start to see Japan turning up everywhere in his work, and nowhere is it more obvious than in the portrait he painted of his old friend, the paint seller Pretengi. At first glance, it looks like a simple picture of a bearded man in a round hat sitting with his hands folded in his lap, but look behind him. The entire wall is papered with Japanese prints. A snow-covered Mount Fuji rises directly above his head. There are geishas, flowering branches, and wide landscapes crowded all around him like panels of stained glass. And Tanguy sits calmly in the center of it all, his hands folded in a pose that makes him look almost like a seated Buddha. This was no accident. Van Gogh was using his friend's portrait as a kind of love letter to Japanese art. Around this same time, he wrote a line to his brother Theo that really says it all. He said that all of his work was to some extent based on Japanese art. If you're enjoying this story of Van Gogh's hidden obsession, take a quick second to subscribe, because it only gets stranger from here. Now let's talk about what these prints actually did to the way he painted. The prints didn't just give Van Gogh new things to paint. They changed how he saw. Traditional European painting was built on depth. Artists used shadow and perspective to make a flat canvas feel like a window into a three-dimensional world. Japanese prints did almost the opposite. They used flat areas of pure, bright color with bold black outlines and strong diagonal lines. They cropped objects right at the edge of the frame, left the middle of the picture wide open, and often dropped shadows altogether. Van Gogh fell in love with all of it. He began flattening his own scenes, simplifying his shapes, and pushing his colors until they almost vibrated on the canvas. In the summer of 1888, he wrote to Theo and described exactly what was happening to him. He said that after a while, your vision changes, and you begin to see with a more Japanese eye, and you feel color differently. You can watch it happen in his painting The Bedroom, where the floor tilts up toward you and the walls press flat against the surface, just like a woodblock print. The Japanese way of seeing had stopped being something Van Gogh studied. It had quietly become the way he looked at the entire world. And that is when his obsession took its strangest turn yet. By early 1888, Van Gogh was worn down by the gray winters and the constant noise of Paris. In his mind, he had built up this glowing image of Japan as a land of bright sun, clear air, and simple, happy artists living close to nature. He had never been there, of course. He only knew it from cheap prints and a few romantic novels. But he became convinced that he could find that Japan without ever leaving France. He just had to go south. So in February 1888, he boarded a train for the town of Arles in the warm south of France. He later told a fellow painter that he kept staring out of the train window the entire way down, watching to see if the landscape had started to look like Japan yet. When he finally arrived, he decided that it had. He wrote to Theo that he no longer needed to dream about traveling to Japan, because the south of France was the equivalent of Japan. He told his sister that he kept saying it to himself, over and over, that he was in Japan now. The bright fields, the blossoming orchards, the strong southern sunlight. To Vincent, this was his Japan, finally made real. He had left almost his entire print collection back in Paris with Theo. He didn't feel he needed the prints anymore. He had learned to see straight through them. In Arles, he rented a small house and painted it bright yellow, and he began to dream even bigger. He believed that Japanese artists didn't work alone and compete with one another. He imagined that they lived together as humble brothers, sharing their work and their lives. So he decided to build that exact thing inside his yellow house. A colony of painters in the south of France, a little family of artists, his own Japan on French soil. He even wrote to his fellow painters and asked them to swap self-portraits with him, the way he imagined Japanese artists traded their work. And in his own self-portrait, the one he made for the painter Paul Gauguin, Van Gogh set his face against a pale green background and described himself as a simple Buddhist monk, a worshipper of the eternal Buddha. He later admitted, in a letter, that he had even painted his own eyes slightly slanted to look, in his words, like the Japanese. He was no longer just collecting Japan. He was trying to become it. But a dream built on top of an imaginary country is a fragile thing. In the autumn of 1888, Gauguin finally came to live with him in the Yellow House. For a few weeks, it almost looked like the dream might actually work. The two painters worked side by side day after day, but they argued constantly, and the tension grew darker and darker until one night that December it all exploded. After a final confrontation with Gauguin, Van Gogh suffered a breakdown and cut off part of his own ear. Gauguin packed up and left Arles, and the two men never saw each other again. The dream of a southern Japan, of a brotherhood of artists, was over. And yet, even at his lowest point, the obsession held on. When Van Gogh painted himself during his recovery, in the famous self-portrait with bandaged ear, he stood in his studio with the wound still wrapped in cloth. And on the wall behind him, just over his shoulder, hangs a Japanese print. Even now, even here, Japan was still watching over him. Soon after, Van Gogh checked himself into an asylum in the nearby town of St. Army, hoping to finally find some peace. And it was there, near the very end of his life, that Japan gave him one last gift. In January 1890, Theo sent his brother some wonderful news. He and his wife had just had a baby boy, and they were going to name him Vincent, after his uncle. Van Gogh was overjoyed. He wrote that the news gave him more pleasure than he could ever put into words, and he started painting almost immediately. What he made for that baby was a painting of an almond tree in full blossom. Almond trees flower early, right at the very start of spring, which made them a perfect symbol of new life. But look at how he painted it. The branches are cut off sharply at the edges of the canvas. There is no horizon, no busy background, no shadow. Just dark, twisting branches and soft clouds of white flowers spread flat against a brilliant blue sky. It is, without question, the most Japanese painting he ever made. The close cropped branches and the flat open sky come straight out of Hiroshige's prints of blossoming plum trees. The very same kind of image Van Gogh had copied years earlier back in Paris. Even the subject, a delicate blossom set against the sky, was one of the most beloved themes in all of Japanese art. After everything, after the prints, the tracings, and the dream of the South, it all came together in one tender little painting made for a newborn child. Van Gogh called it one of the best and most patiently worked paintings he had ever done. He finished it, and then almost immediately collapsed into the longest and worst breakdown of his entire life. A few months later, in the summer of 1890, Vincent van Gogh was dead. But the story doesn't quite end there. That painting of the almond blossoms, the gift for the baby, never left the family. It hung in the home as the child grew up, and that child, Vincent Willem van Gogh, the boy his uncle had painted his Japan for, grew up to found the Van Gogh Museum in Amsterdam, the very same museum that, to this day, holds his uncle's entire collection of Japanese prints. Those cheap, bright little woodcuts that started all of this are still there, just down the hall from the masterpieces they inspired. Vincent van Gogh never reached Japan. He never saw the cherry blossoms in person, never climbed Mount Fuji, never met the artists he had idolized from across the world. But in a strange way, he didn't have to. He had taught himself to see the entire world through a Japanese lens, and that vision now hangs in nearly every great museum on earth. The swirling skies, the burning colors, the flat golden fields. A piece of that quiet country he never visited lives on inside some of the most famous paintings ever made. So the next time you stand in front of a Van Gogh, look a little closer. Somewhere in those thick, glowing brushstrokes there is a little bit of Japan staring right back at you.